that discussion later. The bottom line is, Lee, you did a heck of a job for our committee. You've been indispensable in negotiating police reform efforts, and you should be proud of what you've accomplished. And I'm very proud of you, and I wish you well. So thank you, my friend.
Senator Graham, because we worked on so many things together, I want to join you in your kind words on behalf of Lee Holmes. He was staff director during a very difficult and challenging time when you were chairman. It wasn't because you were chairman, it just happened that there were challenges.
Well, a lot of it was.
My staff tells me they cannot recall Lee ever losing his temper or uttering a cross word. That is something for Senate work. So, Lee, that's high praise. Thank you for your contributions, especially on the First Step Act. I understand you're headed back home to South Carolina with your beloved wife, Brianne, your daughter, Lucy, and your dog, Winston, who is often seen in the halls of the Dirksen building. And lucky for us, you're moving to the liberal bastion of Charleston, South Carolina, where you'll continue service as an assistant U.S. attorney. I know I speak for everyone on the committee. We are sustained by the best staff on earth, and you are one of them, and we're going to miss you. Thanks, Lee, for everything you've done. Well, we have some business today. We have 8 nominees and 2 bills. 5 of the nominees listed for the first time will be held over at the request of the minority. Eunice Lee, 2nd Circuit, Veronica Rossman, 10th Circuit, 3 nominees to the Western District of Washington, David Estudio, Lauren King, and Tana Lynn. We're going to consider those nominees after we return from the break for the 4th of July. We will vote today on 3 nominees. Margaret Strickland for the U.S. District Court in New Mexico. She has a distinguished career in criminal practice as well as civil practice, which is great. She served as a public defender and civil rights attorney. Also, she has worked in areas of civil practice in the private side, so her breadth of courtroom experience is remarkable. She has tried approximately 90 cases. There are a few people in America can say that. And the vast majority of her practice was taking place in federal courts. The ABA says she is well qualified, and I think she'll do a great job. David Chipman is nominated to lead the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Explosives, better known as ATF, 25 years in law enforcement, the vast majority with ATF. Special agent, he witnessed firsthand the real danger that gun crime and illicit gun trafficking pose to communities, and the dangers they particularly face people in law enforcement because of this. As a result, as a responsible gun owner who's advocated for common sense constitutional gun safety measures, as someone who's worked to bolster health and safety for law enforcement, Mr. Chipman is uniquely positioned to restore both credibility and accountability. This is a test. This nomination is a test. Can we put someone in charge of the ATF? You know, it's been 6 years. No one's there because we couldn't reach an agreement on any person. I hope the right person at this moment. Ms. Ur Jadoo is nominated to head the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, USCIS. Has almost 20 years of experience in immigration law and policy. She would be the first woman to serve in that position. She's well qualified for it. Sorely need experience and competent leadership there. She's the daughter of immigrants from Mexico and Iraq. Ms. Jadoo began her career working on immigration policy and oversight for 9 years in the House. She later served as chief counsel at USCIS, and as chief counsel, she managed more than 200 attorneys supporting the work of that agency worldwide. The American Federation of Government Employees National Citizenship and Immigration Service Council 119, the union that represents over 13,000 employees there, specifically highlighted this in their letter of support, saying she's well acquainted with the operations of this agency. We also have 2 bipartisan bills on the markup agenda that are interesting and have some controversy to them. A bill I'm co-sponsoring with Chuck Grassley on cameras in the courtroom related to the Supreme Court, and a bill that Senators Grassley and Klobuchar are bringing before us called Sunshine in the Courtroom Act. As we approach the end of another Supreme Court term, many of us have been intently watching the news for updates on latest decisions. While we may disagree on how the justices decide a case, I hope we can agree that it would be healthy for our democracy for the American people to actually see the court in action. That's what's behind this bill. We worked on this on a bipartisan basis, and I hope we can pass both of these bills today. There are a number of amendments. With that, I'll turn to Ranking Member Grassley.
I can't do better than Senator Durbin did in just describing why we need cameras in the courtroom. I've been involved with this issue, for those of you who've been on this committee for a long period of time, for just so many years. I hope we can finally get this done at this time. I think if the people can see how justice is done, they'll have a better appreciation for that justice. Right now, the working of the court is a remote process that most people don't really know much about. Unless they're lawyers or criminals, these bills would help change all that for 330 million Americans. The Cameras in the Courtroom Act tells the Supreme Court to televise its hearings absent a vote by a majority of the caucus or the court, that doing so would violate due process. The Sunshine in the Courtroom Act allows presiding judges to televise their proceedings subject to various protections for security and for due process. There's a lot of talk these days about reforming the courts in a way that that's just a preemptive threat against justices for ruling in ways that people might not like. These bills aren't in that category. These are actual reforms to get actual transparency and improve civic health. I hope we can report these bills out today and bring greater transparency to the workings of this third branch. Now to the nominees. Margaret Strickland is a nominee to the District of New Mexico. Without a doubt, she's an accomplished criminal defense attorney, like the vast majority of Biden's nominees. Also, like the vast majority of this administration's nominees, Ms. Strickland won't admit to having a judicial philosophy. At the same time, when Ms. Strickland applied to be district judge, her reaction was apparently to call Chris King, demand justice for advice. To borrow from one of my Democratic friends, I can't help but notice coincidences sometimes. If you reach out to demand justice about getting a judgeship and you then get that judgeship, the burden is on that person to show me that you're a Bill of Rights judge and not a criminal defense judge. Ms. Strickland, unfortunately, doesn't satisfy that burden. I will also be opposing the nomination of Ms. Jadot to be Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. This decision comes from the way she didn't answer questions. I've long had concern DHS's unlawful use of parole authority to grant parole to broad classes of people. In my view, this is a clear violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act's requirements that parole be granted, quote, unquote, only on a case-by-case basis. In my exchange with Ms. Jadot, during her confirmation hearing and at her responses to my questions for the record, she did not appear to share that view. She also refused to rule out the use of executive authority to bypass Congress and grant parole in place to broad classes of people who meet eligibility criteria in bills Congress has either rejected or refused to pass. As an example, in my questions for the record, I specifically asked Ms. Jadot if she supported a plan put forward by then presidential candidate, now Vice President Harris, to bypass Congress and grant parole in place to potentially millions of immigrants who have not been granted a path to legal counsel status by Congress. She refused to answer. Given ongoing debates in Congress about offering a path to legal status to various groups of people living in the United States and having violated our laws to get here, her refusal to endorse any real limits on executive branch use of parole authority greatly concerns me. Lastly, we have David Chipman to be head of ATF. Ever since Mr. Chipman's nomination was announced, I have been hearing from law-abiding gun owners in Iowa who are concerned about this nomination. He hasn't dispelled these concerns during his confirmation process. In fact, he probably reinforced them. Mr. Chipman wants to ban assault weapons, but can't seem to explain what an assault weapon is. Mr. Chipman has repeatedly mocked gun owners as rubes and tussles. Mr. Chipman has been described by CNN as, quote, unquote, a fierce advocate for gun control. Indeed, there isn't a prominent gun controller he hasn't worked for. This nomination is like a Republican putting the NRA in charge of the ATF. Aside from Mr. Chipman, ATF has also failed to fully respond to my and Senator Johnson's oversight request regarding the October 2018 Hunter Biden firearms incident. That's when Hunter Biden's gun was discarded near a school. In response, ATF used the Freedom of Information Act to shield to not produce records. That position shows an incompetent agency in need of reform. But instead of getting a reformer, it gets an activist. I will be opposing that nomination.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. The first nomination is Margaret Strickland to be U.S. District Judge for the District of New Mexico. Are there any senators seeking recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Ms. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons.
Aye.
Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn.
No.
Mr. Lee.
No.
Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley.
No.
Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No by proxy.
Ms. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair, the votes are 12 yeas, 10 nays.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. The next nominee,
Mr. Chairman, may I ask unanimous consent that my statement on the Strickland nomination be made part of the record?
of course.
Thank you.
Unfavorably reporting the nomination of David Chipman to be Director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Recognition. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose David Chipman's nomination to serve as the Director of ATF for many reasons. Almost too many reasons here to name them individually, so I'll attempt to focus on my top few concerns. In response to questions at his confirmation hearing before this committee, Mr. Chipman said he was a cop, not a lawyer. This statement is troubling not only because Mr. Chipman was using it to dodge legitimate questions, but also because in making it, he willfully ignores that the focus of the ATF Director's position is to accurately interpret and apply the laws Congress writes for the regulation of the firearms industry. I'm not saying that it takes a lawyer to do that, but it certainly takes someone who recognizes the impact of regulatory decisions. I'm concerned that Mr. Chipman used that cute line to persuade us that his advocacy background is less troubling than it might otherwise appear to be. Based on Mr. Chipman's bombastic and often inaccurate statements made while working as a lobbyist for two major anti-gun groups, Giffords and Everytown, I have strong concerns about his ability to set aside his personal views, to work with the firearms industry and with law-abiding gun owners to effectively run ATF. For example, just last year, Mr. Chipman made a statement openly mocking first-time gun owners. He compared them to the Tiger King, a popular reality TV star who exhibited questionable judgment in relation to firearms and also large endangered megafauna. He also then advised them to hide their newly purchased firearms behind the cans of tuna and beef jerky they have stored in a cabinet and only bring them out if the zombies start to appear. That's a direct quote. Now, when I asked Mr. Chipman about this troubling statement in his television interview, he attempted to say that the statement was misunderstood and that it was taken out of context. That's simply not true. I watched the TV interview, hoping and frankly expecting that I had misunderstood his condescension toward first-time gun owners in 2020. Many of those first-time gun owners in 2020, by the way, were minorities and women. But unfortunately, that was not the case. When I watched it to get the context, that was the context. That's exactly what he had said. There was no taking it out of context. That was the entire context. When asked about inaccurate statements he made when lobbying against suppressors, namely that only gun lobbyists and criminals, this is an exact quote, only gun lobbyists and criminals who want to kill people would benefit, close quote, from the deregulation of gun suppressors. Again, when asked about this question, he dodged the question. Mr. Chipman refused to recognize that many lawful gun owners want to purchase suppressors to protect their hearing, which is a lawful purpose last time I checked, but find the burdensome NFA registration process and the $200 tax stamp on top of the cost of the suppressor to be something that is prohibitive. When pressed by multiple senators on his advocacy for an assault weapons ban on AR-15s, Mr. Chipman proved equally evasive, refusing to provide his definition of an assault weapon. Now, has he suddenly forgotten the policies he's advocated for over the last 5 years? I highly doubt it. It's much more likely that he wanted to obscure his true anti-gun views from the American people. The only straight answer he gave was that he supports a ban on not just the manufacture and sale of AR-15 rifles, the most popular rifles in America, but even the possession of AR-15 rifles unless registered under the NFA. That means he wants to make the millions of law-abiding Americans who currently own AR-15 rifles go through the burdensome process of registering them with the ATF, the organization he now wants to head. I asked Mr. Chipman about the following troubling statement he posted on Reddit. Quote, "While at ATF, I conducted studies involving to determine how many later committed crimes with a gun. Many did. This is a perfect opportunity to arrest people before committing crimes rather than responding after the fact." Close quote. That is a direct quote. He actually said that. Now, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I would ask you, regardless of which political party you belong to, imagine that if a president of either political party said that for any other nomination, particularly if it was a president of the opposite political party to which you belong. If somebody who had been nominated to head an important law enforcement agency within the federal government had said that, you'd find it troubling. I have no doubt that you would, because we don't arrest people before they commit crimes. That's the sort of thing that's reserved for bad post-apocalyptic dystopian novels and movies. Now, in this instance, Mr. Chipman attempted to say that the statement was taken out of context and that he was referring only to those people who had committed the predicate crime of, quote-unquote, lying and trying. But this answer was unconvincing. Setting aside the serious Second Amendment concerns with this statement, completely setting those aside, confirming someone to lead a federal law enforcement agency with this lack of respect for the most fundamental notions of due process, who makes statements that sound like they came out of the movie Minority Report, is appalling and incredibly concerning to the millions of law-abiding gun owners in America. For these reasons and many, many others, I strongly oppose the nomination of David Chipman to be the director of ATF.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Feinstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I believe that David Chipman is not only qualified, but he's a person that we need in this position at this time. He's the leader that ATF needs, and I want to just share with you that I am very concerned about where this country is going with violence and guns. We are currently experiencing a wave of gun violence. So far, 21,000 people in the United States have died, lost their lives through gun violence. In fact, during Mr. Chipman's own nomination hearing, and while I was speaking, a gunman in San Jose, California, shot and killed 9 innocent people. So there are staccato shots of guns that, like I've never heard, in the numbers that are building up. Mr. Chipman's support for the enforcement of common sense gun restrictions, his dedication to ensuring that the ATF fulfills its mission of protecting our country, make him the candidate we need in this role at this time. I think he's uniquely qualified to lead the ATF. He's a former ATF agent. He knows what it's like on the streets. And I learned in a long time as mayor that the streets teach you a lot about what people are doing and thinking. He's uniquely qualified to lead the ATF. So I think I will strongly vote for him. I hope enough members will vote for him, because with 21,000 people now dead from gun violence just in a short period of time, I think we need to look a little differently at what these jobs mean. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thanks, Senator
Chairman.
Feinstein. Senator Blackburn, and then Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and pardon me. We all know that the Second Amendment protects and guarantees our right to keep and bear arms. And the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives plays an important part in combating crime and protecting public safety. The director of the ATF should be an individual who is capable of pursuing this mission while maintaining a nonpartisan atmosphere within the organization and protecting the rights of law-abiding citizens. Now, that is the mission. Based on what we've all heard from Mr. Chipman in his testimony, based on what we've read, statements that he has made, he is showing himself incapable of meeting that mission and doing so in a nonpartisan and even-handed way. What we would expect from anyone that we appoint. Now, there are roughly 15.5 million Americans that hold hunting licenses. Nearly 20 million Americans have a concealed carry permit. I am one of those that has a concealed carry permit.
Don't mess with Marcia.
Roughly 4 in 10 Americans report having a registered firearm in their residence, and nearly every major study has found that firearms are used in self-defense between 500,000 and 3 million times each and every year. That is the right of American citizens. Mr. Chipman has demonstrated through his testimony that he will neither respect nor protect the right to bear arms. There are 16 states, 30% of our nation, that allow citizens to openly carry their guns. And you've just heard about his Reddit Ask Me Anything interview. He stated there that open carry is frightening, and he thinks this is a fear we should avoid. Tennessee is a constitutional carry state. Mr. Chipman made clear in his testimony last month that he wants to ban the future manufacturing and sale of, and I'm quoting him, assault weapons. But he has demonstrated that he has an alarming misunderstanding of what an assault weapon actually is. I asked him if he referred to common semi-automatic rifles as assault weapons, and he affirmed yes, he did. His definition, as Senator Cotton put it so aptly, would effectively ban all sporting rifles in the United States. But we know Mr. Chipman is no fool. Mr. Chipman has an agenda. It would be abridging our Second Amendment rights. It would be banning semi-automatic rifles and sporting rifles for those 15.5 million Americans that have a hunting license. He has a decorated history with the anti-gun lobby. As has been referenced, he has lobbied for Everytown for gun safety and was a senior policy advisor at the Giffords campaign. He has lobbied against high-capacity guns, but has defined a high-capacity gun as anything that holds more than 10 bullets at a time. He has advocated overturning the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which would leave gun manufacturers liable for what purchasers do with their guns. I want you to think about that. It would make the gun manufacturers liable for what purchasers do with their gun. The logic falls apart when you apply it elsewhere. We do not hold auto manufacturers liable when drivers cause pileups. Most of the U.S. drives to and from work every day. Can you imagine what would happen if we suddenly applied this type logic to the actions of every single driver in this country? The logic with respect to guns is no different, but Mr. Chipman is far too partisan to see that. Again, he is no fool. He does have an agenda. And in 2017, he co-authored a blog for Giffords calling for 50 cal rifles to be regulated under the National Firearms Act. In other words, Mr. Chipman is willing to lie to push his anti-gun agenda. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives deserves a better leader. Americans deserve a better leader. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Blackburn. Senators requesting recognition are Senator Leahy, Klobuchar, and Hawley. Yes, Blumenthal. Cope, Cornyn. Senator Leahy.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it seems that any time we'd be there to follow the law and to enforce the law when it involves guns, you would think that we're suddenly disarming people in the United States. We know people in the United States are not disarmed. We see this every other day. There's a mass shooting in the United States, and people do have guns. Mr. Chipman's a lifelong gun owner. But he knows that responsible gun ownership and common sense safety measures go hand in hand. We've had the Bureau without a permanent director since 2015. Well, there's probably a reason for that, because every time anybody talks about going in there to the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, everyone starts saying, oh my gosh, they're going to take our guns away. Well, I'm a gun owner. I'm probably the only person in this room that has a pistol range in his backyard. How many members of this committee have a pistol range in their backyard? Okay, so we got 3, and me, 4.
I don't. I don't have one.
You don't have one. Your backyard's a little bit different than my 300-acre farm, let me tell you. But the point is, I helped put myself through college with a scholarship because of my skill on rifle team. And the medals I won, the competitions I won. And somebody who's born blind in one eye, that was one thing I could do. I enjoy shooting. I enjoy target shooting. I also was a prosecutor, and I convicted a lot of people who used guns in crimes, people who were already had felonies and still were able to buy guns at gun shows, people who were end up sometimes killing people because of that, who should have been safe. Let's not be afraid of somebody actually enforcing the laws that are on the books, which is what Mr. Chipman do. I'm not afraid of that. I'm not going to have my guns taken away, nor Senator Cornyn's, nor any other law-abiding person. But if we're going to have laws on the books that the ATF is supposed to enforce, well, let's, after all these years without a permanent director, let's have one. I'll vote for it.
Senators seeking recognition: Klobuchar, Hawley, Blumenthal, Cornyn. Any others? Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So I want to put this in context beyond Mr. Chipman. I led the effort for the last ATF director that actually got confirmed. You have to go back nearly 20 years. We've had one. He was from Minnesota. So during the time of Donald Trump, we had no confirmed ATF director. So I don't think this is just about Mr. Chipman. I think this is about the NRA. I think it's about people not wanting to hurt themselves and get some kind of points off or a B grade instead of an A grade. That's what I think this is about. Because when I did this back a few years back, it was toward the end of President Obama's term, the guy's name is Todd Jones. He was a decorated Marine. He was the U.S. Attorney. And I had to work all day one day just to get him through on a cloture vote. He was the acting U.S. Attorney. He was the U.S. Attorney, but he was also the acting ATF Director, had not been in any scandals, had done a good job by all accounts when he was there, having inherited an agency that had some issues. But I got finally, after I think it was 8 hours we left the vote open. I got 6 Republicans to vote with me. 2 of them are still here, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. One of them was John McCain. You want to question his views on guns? I don't think so. So I think what this is about the NRA. He has spent his career working to keep the American people safe. He served at the ATF for almost 25 years, more than half of the agency's existence as a special agent, field office manager, and chief of the firearms program divisions. If confirmed, he would actually be the first director to have served as an ATF special agent. So to say this is just some political appointment when it's actually the first guy that would have worked there for a long time, I think that's wrong. A lifelong gun owner, Mr. Chipman knows that responsible gun ownership and common sense safety measures go hand in hand, and his approach to gun violence stems from his belief that it is possible to balance rights and responsibilities. For many years, I have led the bill, common sense legislation, to close a dangerous loophole that allows domestic abusers to buy a gun simply when they're not married to the victims, but in fact are their boyfriends. We had a hearing on this many, many years ago, and Senator Grassley had several witnesses, very conservative witnesses, a conservative sheriff. And while they did not agree with the stalking portion of the bill, they actually agreed with closing this loophole, full stop, every single one of them. Yet, we can't even seem to get that done because of the NRA. Mr. Chipman's nomination has the support of numerous organizations, including the Hispanic American Police Command Officers Association, the Police Executive Research Forum, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and 17 current state attorney generals. His decades of experience in law enforcement make him exactly the right nominee for this critical position. And when I asked him, as ATF Director, would he take on this small issue of closing this loophole that the Republican witnesses support, he said it would be one of his top priorities to get this done if he was confirmed as ATF Director. So I don't think we can just look at this nominee on some isolated island. This is a part of a whole effort, and it's political. He's not political. How we've handled the ATF has been political. Or we would have had a director under Donald Trump. We would have had a director confirmed under President Obama, and I wouldn't have had a cloture vote held open for 8 hours for a decorated Marine just to be able to have him be the only person confirmed as head of the ATF, the only person in 20 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar. We'll recognize Senator Hawley next. Senator Blumenthal, Cornyn, and Kennedy are in the wings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to say that I appreciated Senator Feinstein raising the issue of violent crime. I thought that that was an important point to make, and I appreciated her comment that the streets teach you a lot. And I think this is an important context for today's vote and indeed the issues that are facing the committee. As a former head prosecutor of my state, former attorney general of my state, I agree with that comment that the streets teach you a lot. I think that's absolutely right. And what the streets are teaching us now is that we are in the midst of a massive violent crime wave in this country. A massive violent crime wave in this country. Homicides are up over 30% in our major cities over the last year. That includes in my state. I have police officers when I go home to my state who beg me for help. And I mean beg me for help. Whether it's big cities, and Missouri's a diverse state. We've got big cities, we've got small towns, we've got rural areas, and wherever I go, police officers come to me and they say, we are desperate for help. We are outmanned, we are outgunned, we are overwhelmed, we can't recruit people, our morale is collapsing, we feel we have no support. It is a simple reality, and the American people are feeling it. The people in my state are feeling it. They are afraid to go out at night. They're afraid to go out on the streets. They're afraid to drop their children off at school. I mean, this is not the United States of America that we should have. This is a pressing issue that is affecting every single American, and yes, every cop in America. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, I raise this because I hope this committee will soon turn to this issue of violent crime in our country, and do something about it, and do something to support the men and women in blue who are out there on the line. And I have to say that in this context, when Mr. Chipman says things like, with regard to the Secret Service, I asked him about this when he was sitting right over there. He said in 2012 that their, meaning the Secret Service, use of guns, shooting guns is not, he goes on then to say, we need to think of strategies like that of just covering and evacuating in our schools. Now, he denied that he said that when he was in front of us. I don't know why, because it's on the record. We gave it to him as a QFR. I mean, you can go read the transcript yourself. My point is this. I don't think that our schools should be less safe. I can't vote for someone who says we ought to make schools in this country less safe in the midst of a crime epidemic. I don't know what I would tell the parents in my state. And when I look at Mr. Chipman's agenda, which is to take away Second Amendment rights from law-abiding citizens while violent criminals are loose on our streets, I just have to say, Mr. Chairman, I just respectfully disagree that that's the right agenda for us to have at this time. So I will not be supporting Mr. Chipman, and I hope that the committee will soon turn its attention to the epidemic of violent crime in our country. I hope we can find some solutions that we can agree on, and I respectfully submit, this is a question for another time, I respectfully submit that increasing officer pay and increasing the number of officers on the street is something where we might start. But for those reasons, I'll be opposing Mr. Chipman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Hawley. We have 3 senators seeking recognition, and I will close the debate at that point. We'll have a vote on Mr. Chipman at that moment. Senator Blumenthal is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. you know, a number of us on this committee share an experience in law enforcement. Like my colleague from Missouri, I was our state's attorney general for some 20 years. I was the United States attorney in Connecticut, the chief federal prosecutor, and I believe more than anything, and I talk about it frequently, in enforcement, fair and effective enforcement of our laws. In fact, our laws are dead letter unless they're enforced. And that's why I'm going to vote for David Chipman. He is, above everything else, an enforcer. That's his life's experience, 25 years as an agent in ATF. He believes in enforcement. And if my colleagues across the aisle are really serious about stopping the wave of gun violence that we see in our streets, they will vote for David Chipman. If they are really serious about stopping violent crime, they will support effective enforcement of laws. And we can agree that this nation is awash in an ocean of crime guns, stolen and lost guns that have spurred a wave of violent crime across the country, focused mainly on the streets and communities that have those lost and stolen guns. So very briefly, there is a lot of mischaracterization and misrepresentation of what David Chipman has done or said, but at the end of the day, it is his enforcement background that makes him eminently qualified. I agree that we should address gun violence. In fact, Subcommittee on the Constitution has been having hearings on gun violence, on ghost guns, and red flag statutes, and other measures that can help to stop gun violence. So I welcome that focus and hope that we will confirm the nomination of a man who will be the second, only the second, confirmed director of ATF, a man who has spent 25 years of his life at that agency, a man who is dedicated to making these laws real in people's lives and making our streets and communities safer. And if my colleagues are really serious about fighting crime, they will say no to the NRA and other groups that have said again and again they want effective enforcement. They say continuously they want enforcement of existing laws, not new laws. Well, if they want effective enforcement, they ought to be in favor of David Chipman. And we need new laws, no question, but we also need effective enforcement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Cruz is now asked to be added to the list. I would just say to the members, this is a critically important issue and deserves all the time that we're going to devote to it. I don't question that for 1 minute. Another nomination and several bills before us today. We have other committees that have scheduled hearings, and we have votes scheduled at 10:30 or 10:45. So the cooperation of the members in making their comments concise would be appreciated. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief. When Mr. Chipman came before the committee, I asked him whether he believed that a law-abiding gun owner was a threat to public safety. Paraphrasing his answer, he said, "No, Senator, until they commit a crime." In other words, he views law-abiding citizens as potential criminals and uses that as a justification to restrict their rights under the Second Amendment to the Constitution. Like Senator Blackburn, and Senator Leahy, I guess, I'm a gun owner, and I don't believe I'm a threat to public safety. I don't believe Senator Leahy or Senator Blackburn are a threat to public safety as law-abiding gun owners. I see them as exercising their rights under the Second Amendment, and I support that. Most of our states have license to carry laws. Some states, like Vermont, you can carry a gun without a permit. And my state is joining Vermont with recent legislative action, because we don't believe law-abiding gun owners are a threat to public safety, unlike apparently the nominee. But I would just say that anyone surprised with the desire of American citizens to purchase firearms to defend themselves and their families and their property in response to the defund police effort, I can't imagine why they would be surprised. If people believe that the law enforcement in their community should be defunded, the combination of that, along with the Ferguson effect that I think former FBI Director Comey talked about, the hesitancy of law enforcement to aggressively enforce the laws because of fear that they would be criticized if not prosecuted. We've seen this reflected in the decreased morale of law enforcement departments all across the country, difficulties in recruiting, huge increases in police officers retiring. Morale in our police departments is in the tank, primarily because of this unjustified effort to attack the very people we depend upon for our safety. That more and more Americans are seeking to defend themselves by exercising their Second Amendment rights should not be a surprise. So, Mr. Chairman, I will not support Mr. Chipman's nomination for the very reason that he views all law-abiding Americans as potential criminals. I think that's disqualifying.
Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, I wasn't going to say anything, but I feel the need to respond to the comments of my good friend Senator Klobuchar. I think even a cursory examination of Mr. Chipman's record and even a casual observer of his testimony can see that he is a zealot. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a zealot. This is America. You can believe what you want. But he's being asked to run an agency whose mission is to even-handedly apply the law. And the reason I'm voting against this gentleman is because I believe he will use his position, based on his record and his testimony, to try to prosecute an agenda that he can't get by the voters through their elected representatives. And I wanted to say that for the record. Now, Senator Klobuchar, if you have any evidence that I'm voting against this gentleman, and I say this gently because I'm worried about the NRA or losing points on the NRA, I'd like to hear it.
I have the evidence that we have not confirmed an ATF director during this entire last 2 decades, except for one, and I get votes to get cloture by Republicans that they were concerned about how the NRA would rank.
But I'm asking about this Republican.
That is my evidence of
I'm
what's
asking
happened
about
here.
this Republican.
I can't get inside your brain or know your politics. I'm just saying in general, there is more evidence besides this one man about what's going on in our legislative efforts, what's going on in Congress, why we haven't been able to pass even common sense background checks when 90% of the American people support them. So I think this is much bigger than one guy. I just thought that point should be made.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And
Thank you.
by the way, even President Trump's nominee was too because of concerns by Republicans on the gun issue. So it just never ends.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The last speaker before me, I think, is Senator Cruz, unless someone else is seeking recognition. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's interesting to hear our Democratic colleagues seeing boogeymen under every rock. And there is the frightful specter of the NRA on one side. There's the frightful specter of the Koch brothers on the other side. There are charts of dark money with red string and all sorts of perceived connections. There is a simpler explanation, which is that the American people actually value our right to keep and bear arms. You want to know who the members on this side are listening to? It's not some interest group. It's the hundreds of millions of Americans who want their constitutional rights protected, who want to be able to defend their families, and who don't want to see the government taking away their right to defend their home, their lives, and their family. That's something our Democratic friends don't seem to understand. This is not about a checkbook in Washington, D.C. This is about millions of constituents at home. I promise you, when John Cornyn and I go home, it's not the NRA we're worried about. It's Texans looking at us saying, don't you let them take our guns. And there are folks in every state here who feel that way. You know, it was striking during the campaign. In August 2019, Joe Biden was asked about people who think that a Biden administration, quote, means they're going to come for my guns. And Biden replies, bingo! You're right. If you have an assault weapon, the fact of the matter is they should be illegal, period. So we can thank President Biden for letting the cat out of the bag. He's made clear his agenda, and let's use the exact words, they're going to come for my guns, bingo. That's what Joe Biden promised America he wanted to do. And in this case with Mr. Chipman, this is the manifestation of the promise, we're going to come for your guns. Mr. Chipman is a gun control zealot. He spent the last 6 years of his life working for one of the leading gun control organizations. And he came before this committee, and his testimony was remarkable. He testified that he thought Senator Feinstein's legislation on assault weapons didn't go nearly far enough. Now, Senator Feinstein and I disagree on that legislation, disagree strongly. Her sentiments are heartfelt, they're genuine. But Mr. Chipman said Senator Feinstein didn't go nearly far enough. She sought to ban some 2,000 different models of rifles, but he said it didn't go nearly far enough because he'd go after every single weapon people own right now, that he wouldn't just focus on the new sales. He was interested in whatever guns you have at your home right now to defend your family. And to be clear, Senator Feinstein's legislation wasn't just filed, it wasn't just considered in this committee, it was voted on the Senate floor. In the year 2013, I just arrived at the Senate. I was a brand new freshman. Had been here about as long as Senator Padilla, Senator Ossoff. It was the Harry Reid Senate. So I was in the minority. There was a substantial majority of Democrats in the Senate. Senator Feinstein's bill to ban so-called assault weapons, voted on the Senate floor, received 60 no votes. In a Democratic Senate, among the senators voting no were Senator Bennett, Senator Heinrich, Senator Manchin, Senator Tester, Senator Udall, and Senator Warner, all Democrats, voted no. And Mr. Chipman says that that bill, that in a Harry Reid Democratic Senate could muster only 40 votes, it didn't go far enough. We need to be even more aggressive going after your guns. Now, I recognize in extreme left partisan environments, that sounds like a terrific idea. I recognize that there are Democrats who've run for office promising that we need judges and justices on the Supreme Court who will vote to overturn the Heller decision and to, in effect, repeal the individual right to keep and bear arms. But that's not the view of the American people. And it's not some mysterious lobby in town. It is hundreds of millions of Americans that value their freedom, their constitutional rights. And I got to tell you, this past year, there were a whole lot of Americans who hadn't actually thought a lot about the Second Amendment until suddenly we had riots in American cities all across the country. till suddenly we had police cars being firebombed and shops being looted and people being murdered on the street in city after city after city, and we saw local Democratic politicians turn a blind eye to the violence. One Democratic politician described weeks and weeks of rioting and burning and violence, described it as, it's the summer of love. Well, I think actually elected officials have a responsibility to keep their citizens safe. I think writing off rioting and criminal violence as the summer of love is incredibly cynical and a dereliction of duty. But you know what? In a lot of those blue states, in a lot of those blue cities in blue states, there were a whole lot of folks that suddenly went to a gun store and said, you know what? If there's going to be a riot outside my house, I want to be able to defend myself if someone starts coming in the door or coming in the window seeking to do harm for my family. And by the way, when you have Democrats proposing abolishing the police, and not just proposing it, implementing it in cities like Minneapolis and cities like Portland and cities like New York City and cities tragically like Austin, Texas, slashing the budgets for police and seeing crime skyrocket, and then scratching their heads going, gosh, why would crime skyrocket? We just slashed the budgets for the police. You can understand why people say, if you're going to take away the police officers, for God's sakes, don't take away my ability to defend my family. I think Mr. Chipman is a nominee who is far out of the mainstream. If his position is what he told this committee, that he thinks we should go much further than Senator Feinstein's legislation, which commanded only 40 votes in a Democratic majority Senate, that does not reflect where the American people are. And this nomination is a chance for Senate Democrats to decide. I assume the membership of this committee that every Democrat in this committee is going to vote for Mr. Chipman. This tends to be a committee on both sides of the aisle that attracts some of the members who are more comfortable with taking clear positions. But there are at least some Democrats in the conference who, when they go home to their home states, they tell their constituents they support the Second Amendment. Some ways I'm grateful to President Biden for making this nomination because it's a clarifying moment. Every one of those Democrats who goes home and tells their constituents, no, I believe in the Second Amendment. No, I don't believe in confiscation. No, I won't ban guns. No, we shouldn't do that. Well, we got a nominee who supports confiscation, who wants to ban guns, who wants a registry, and who was appointed to carry out Joe Biden's promise, bingo, we're coming after your guns. So now it's a chance for each of the 50 Democrats to decide, where do you stand?
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Cotton has asked for recognition.
Yeah, I'll keep this brief. I think in some ways, David Chipman for President Biden is a perfectly suitable nominee. This administration has already marked itself out as the most anti-gun and pro-crime administration in American history. President Biden gave a speech yesterday afternoon that was supposed to be about how to stop a crime wave that is crashing across this country with a murder rate that's increased in the single biggest jump on record over the last year. And what did he do? He basically threw in the towel. He said, yeah, I know that murders and violent crime went up a lot last year, and they went up a lot in the first few months of this year, but, well, crime goes up in the summer months too, so it's going to get even worse over the next 3 months. So I hope you don't get killed walking the streets of your community. And then what did he talk about? Did he talk about imposing tough sentences on people who commit crimes? Did he talk about adding more cops to the streets and quit attacking cops? No. He talked about gun control, about harassing law-abiding gun owners and gun stores, focusing on a kind of rifle that is less commonly used in murders in America than blunt objects like hammers and bats and frying pans and your bare fists. The vast majority of murders and crimes in this country are committed by pistols, which would be almost totally unaffected by some of the Democrats' proposals. So think about what Joe Biden wants to do. He wants to ignore the gun crimes that are happening in cities across America while he takes away the rifle you have in your home to protect yourself from those very criminals. So again, it shouldn't be surprising that he's nominated a man like David Chipman, an anti-gun radical. In his hearing, I asked him very simply, what is an assault weapon? And he couldn't define it because it's a made-up, fictitious term crafted by a bunch of liberal pollsters and lawyers and politicians in Washington to describe a kind of weapon based on mere cosmetic features. Go into a gun store, look at the labels in the aisles. You can find an aisle for shotguns, you can find one for pistols, you can find one for rifles. You won't find one for assault weapons because it is a fake, made-up term. Now, when I pressed him, he finally acknowledged that he would call an assault weapon, let me be precise here, any semi-automatic weapon larger than a .22 caliber with a detachable magazine. That is almost every modern sporting rifle in America. That is one of the most radical proposals that we have ever heard in Congress. And again, it would do almost nothing to affect the gun crimes that are happening in this country right now. Now, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and all the Democrats in the Senate can talk about why we have this crime wave. Oh, it's the pandemic. People are isolated. They're unemployed. Woe is us. What are we going to do? Well, guess what? The pandemic is basically over and crime is still going up. Other countries face this pandemic as well. They didn't have such a large increase in crime. Let me tell you why we have a large increase in crime. One, we are letting violent, serious, repeat felons out of prison, as this Congress did with the First Step Act. We are refusing to send them to prison in the first place, as radical prosecutors like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco refuse to even do their job. And three, we are harassing the police for doing their jobs, and we are slashing their budgets. That's why we have a crime wave in America, and until we stop it, that crime wave will continue.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. A lot has been said about what Joe Biden believes. Let me read from a statement yesterday. I hope all of you have it, fact sheet provided by the administration addressing the issues of crime and how to deal with them. Let me read the opening paragraph page. The strategy will use the rescue plan, the American Rescue Plan, which we know full well on the Democratic side, the American Rescue Plan's historic funding levels and clear guidance to help state, local, territorial, and tribal governments get the money they need to put more police officers on the beat, with the resources, training, and accountability they need to engage in effective community policing. In addition to supporting proven community violence intervention programs, summer employment opportunities, and other investments we know will reduce crime. Page after page. Page 5, provide law enforcement the tools and resources they need to tackle gun violence. Does that sound like Joe Biden's throwing in the towel on law enforcement? No, not to me. It sounds like he's making an investment in law enforcement, which we all, at least I applaud, and I think is absolutely essential. You see, I represent the city of Chicago, and I'm proud to do it, of gun violence and death unheard of. And we're not the only place. And it isn't just because it's a blue mayor in a blue city in a blue state. It's happening in the downstate red counties and communities as well. One of the reasons I think is very obvious. We are awash in guns, awash in guns. Go into the toughest neighborhoods of Chicago and ask the teenagers there how quickly they can provide you with a gun if you have $50 in hand, and they'll tell you, 15 minutes, can you wait 15 minutes? Over 400 million guns in a nation of 350 million people. We don't think there's a cause and effect here. When they decide to sell guns at gun shows in northwestern Indiana without a background check, those guns find their ways into the streets of Chicago, and that's what we have to deal with. In terms of representing the view of the American people, our friends on the other side have a view of that. 84% of the American people, including most gun owners, believe we should have meaningful background checks. This committee is virtually incapable of passing such legislation. And 54% of Americans, despite all the rhetoric we've heard on assault weapons, believe that they should be at least licensed, not licensed, but at least monitored, and some would go so far as to say they shouldn't be sold. But the fact is, we're not dealing with radical notions when the majority of the American people support what we're saying. The point I would like to make as I close is that we are talking about one individual, David Chipman. And going back to the point made by Amy Klobuchar earlier, the reason that they leave this ATF position vacant is because there's less enforcement as a result of it. And unfortunately, that has been the case, as you well know. David Chipman has certainly been involved in gun safety organizations, but he also has the support of law enforcement, including the Hispanic American Police Commanders, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, 17 current state attorneys general, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, National Black Police, Sheriff David Mahoney of Dane, Wisconsin, Women in Federal Law Enforcement, Prosecutors Against Gun Violence. We all have our opinions on this individual, and I think it's time for us to take a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll on David Chipman.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Ms. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sachs. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Tillis. Ms. Blackburn. Chair Durbin. Chair, the votes are 11 yeas, 11 nays.
The committee's recorded a tie vote on Mr. Chipman's nomination to be Director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives pursuant to Section 3, subsection 1A of Senate Resolution 27 of the 117th Congress. I'll transmit to the Secretary of the Senate a notice of this tie vote. Under Section 3, Section 1B of that resolution, either the majority or minority leader may then make a motion to discharge the nomination. Next, we have the nomination of Cherdu to be Director of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. Does any senator seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No, but proxy.
Mr. Cornyn.
No.
Mr. Lee.
No, but proxy.
Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sachs.
No, but proxy.
Mr. Hawley.
No, but proxy.
Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Tillis.
Pass.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No, by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair, the votes are 11 yeas, 10 nays, 1 pass.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. We have 2 bipartisan bills on the markup agenda today, ripe for consideration: the Durbin-Grassley Cameras in the Courtroom Act and the Grassley-Klobuchar Sunshine in the Courtroom Act. I believe members are familiar with these. I hope they are. The Bill 7, I want to read so that there's no misunderstanding of the intent of this. It says, the Supreme Court shall permit television coverage of all open sessions of the court unless the court decides by a vote of majority of the justices that allowing such coverage in a particular case would constitute a violation of due process rights of one or more parties before the court. That is the sum and substance of the legislation. Any comments or amendments?
Chairman.
Senator Leahy.
Could I be added?
Senator Leahy, without objection, be added as co-sponsor. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to support this legislation. I served 13 years as a Texas judge, 6 on the trial bench, 7 on the Texas Supreme Court. And on the Texas Supreme Court, we had stationary cameras, which were unobtrusive, and basically the casual observer would not even know that the proceeding was being televised. So I know that it is possible to have televised proceedings that do not disrupt the trial or the appellate argument. And I think most people who think about televised court proceedings, they relate back to the O.J. Simpson trial, which was an absolute circus. And unfortunately, I think did create a lot of skepticism about whether television cameras should be allowed in the courtroom. But I believe a responsible judge or judges can handle this authority. And I know that the Supreme Court in particular has been reluctant to embrace this, but, and they've opted for audio recordings of appellate arguments. But I think there's a basic educational function being missed here under the status quo. That I think it's better for the American people to see their institutions, including the judiciary, function in the light of day. One reason why I'm a partner with Senator Leahy on freedom of information reforms is I think that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And when people are skeptical about how their institutions operate, I think in this case, I think it would enhance the stature of the Supreme Court and our judiciary to allow the American people to see how they function, how they make their decisions. I think they will be proud of the way they function, and it will increase public confidence. So that's the reason I support this legislation.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wholeheartedly agree with Senator Cornyn's comments. Also a former prosecutor. I had the experience early on where we had, and this isn't TVs, but it's the same concept of accountability. We had child protection cases, which are not the ones you'd put on TV, and no one was allowed in the courtroom. And the cases were building up, and kids were just left with no future possibility of being adopted from foster care. And finally, we changed the rules to allow a nonprofit group in with red clipboards. I still remember it. So they could start tracking exactly what happened. And it changed everything because there was accountability and people were watching. I believe the same thing is true for regular courtrooms when it comes to TV. And I had the same reaction as Senator Cornyn about the O.J. trial and horrified by what that came out as. However, I have another experience recently, and that is the prosecution of Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. The whole country was able to see those witnesses, was able to see the hell they had gone through for the last year where they felt the burden of could they have done more. And I thought that was a moment of redemption, not entirely redemption for everything that happened and changes that need to be made. And I so appreciate the work that Senator Booker and Senator Scott are engaged in right now. But it was a moment of redemption in part because people could see their fellow citizens talk about what happened, see the police chief of Minneapolis testify, as well as so many other incredible police officers who came forward to talk about what happened. If that hadn't been televised, the verdict would have probably been the same, but people wouldn't have been able to see that and share in that moment, really collective moment of redemption. So right now, all 50 states currently allow some form of media access to state courtrooms, as Senator Cornyn has pointed out, in some capacity. And unfortunately, the same can't be said about federal court proceedings. And there's pretty important cases that happen in federal court. And I also want to note, to get at some of the concerns I think both he and I have shared on this for so long, have shared, as well as Senator Durbin. The bill actually provides safeguards for jurors, for witnesses, and the parties involved. The bill prohibits the broadcasting of any juror during a trial or during the jury selection process. The bill also provides judges discretion to obscure the identities of witnesses who testify, very important. And the bill prevents the presiding judge from allowing media coverage entirely. The judge does not have to allow for that coverage if doing so would violate the due process rights of parties involved. I think that's important. The judge in the Chauvin case had to make a major decision about that, and he made the right one. But he did have the right to not have that on TV and decided to allow it. Our bill allows for that kind of discretion for judges. Thank you.
Senator Klobuchar, I just want to clarify for the record, I think you were describing Senate Bill 818.
I was describing the Sunshine in the Courtroom Act.
Right.
Yes, and I wasn't. The other bill is about the Supreme Court, which I also firmly support.
Which is the bill presently under consideration.
I know, but I thought we were doing all the comments.
I'm happy to, they're very closely related.
I know.
And
So I was
support both
talking
as
about
well.
the Grassley-Klobuchar bill.
Grassley is the common thread you'll notice here in this policy.
Exactly.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to respectfully disagree with some of the sentiments that have been expressed by our colleagues. I think this is a question upon which reasonable people can disagree. And the reason is there are conflicting interests that we want to protect on both sides. I think there is certainly an interest in transparency. There's an interest in the American people having access to and being able to see the workings of our branches of government. And I think that's valuable, and that is the sentiment behind both of these bills. But I think at the flip side, all of us are concerned about the Supreme Court in particular being overly politicized. And cameras in the Supreme Court, there is a reason that virtually every Supreme Court justice opposes this. And I would point out that view is not a partisan view. It's not the Republican nominees oppose this. It's not the Democratic nominees oppose this. Just about every one of them opposes it. You know, here's what Justice Scalia said in 2012 about cameras in the courtroom, in the Supreme Court in particular. He said he believed that televising oral arguments would, quote, miseducate the American people, not educate them. And he explained that was because, quote, what most of the American people would see would be 30-second, 15-second takeouts from our arguments. And those takeouts would not be characteristic of what we do. They would be uncharacteristic. Before I was in the Senate, I spent my career litigating cases before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a unique institution. And I have no doubt that if there were TV cameras at oral arguments, you would see the lawyers for both sides behaving differently and playing to the camera. And unfortunately, you would see justices behaving differently and playing to the camera. And everyone on this committee knows exactly what I'm talking about, because every single one of us behaves dramatically differently when that C-SPAN camera is on than when the camera is off and we're in a classified briefing and suddenly people take their jackets off and they actually have conversations and the entire temperature of the discussion drops about 30 degrees. We see that in our day-to-day life, and every one of us knows it's very different if it's being televised. If it's being televised, my Democratic friends may describe me as really a son of a bitch. Whereas with the cameras off, it maybe is a notch or two less, maybe not. I don't want to see the Supreme Court turning into a political drama. I think there's too much politics at the court. The way I balance those two interests is I have another bill, which is an amendment, and I want to call up my amendment right now. It is Amendment SIL 21744.
Senator, for clarification, this is on 807?
Yes. This amendment is entitled Hear the Courts Act of 2021. And what this amendment tries to do is balance those two interests, and it provides that the Supreme Court put out same-day audio of appellate proceedings. I think the audio provides important transparency. It provides accessibility. I think technologically, particularly during COVID, the Supreme Court has demonstrated it's able to do it. But I think there is far less risk of politicizing the court's oral arguments, decision-making, the questioning, the lawyers' arguments. Releasing the audio provides significant transparency but keeps the court focused on its very important task, which is deciding things according to law. I think it's better for our country if the Supreme Court is a little more boring and doesn't have Judge Judy as the dynamic in the courtroom. And so, to my mind, this substitute amendment strikes the right balance of providing that transparency but also protecting the court from being overly politicized.
Senator.
So before I recognize another member, you would replace 807, which gives authority for televising, and replace it with an audio that would be taken at each court proceeding, is subject to the same discretionary decision by the court.
There is an ability, if there's a reason to keep it confidential for privacy reasons or otherwise, there's the ability to not put it out. But other than in the extraordinary circumstance, it replaces the cameras in the court provision with saying that the Supreme Court and the lower appellate courts shall put out same-day audio.
I have, I'm not sure if I'm going to offer it, but I have a second-degree amendment which would take a different approach and add audio to the video rights. You make it an either-or situation, not an either-or situation, make it audio exclusively. And I have a second-degree amendment which would allow both, again, with court discretion in both cases. But any further conversation by the committee? Senator Klobuchar.
Well, I do appreciate the sentiment of Senator Cruz's remarks here, but just to be clear, so what I know is, and I've talked to Justice Roberts about this, is that he did start putting audios out more regularly, which was a good development. And so all you're trying to say is he would have to do it the same day, which they often do now, I believe, on big arguments, or they have done. But my point is, we're still in a situation where only a couple hundred lucky people get to go into that courtroom, including a number of senators that have gone to watch oral arguments. But the rest of America can't see them. To me, this is some archaic procedure that came out of the horse and buggy days where a few people could come and watch. And I don't understand why just those couple hundred people get to see and why you wouldn't have everyone seeing. But I do appreciate the audio versions that have been made available by the court. I appreciate the sentiment that you want them done, asking them be done right away. But I just don't think this gets us to where we need to go.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Grassley.
I recommend a no vote on this. It's something that I would be willing to consider in addition to the proposed legislation, but not in lieu of it.
Well, that is a question for the committee since I have a second-degree amendment. And Senator Cruz, perhaps we just call an up or down vote on your amendment. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd ask for an up or down vote on my amendment, and then if it fails, where it seems likely it's going to fail based on where people are saying, then if you want to have a second amendment adding audio, I think that would be fine.
Any other senator wish to be recognized? If not, on the Cruz amendment, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Ms. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. No. Ms. Klobuchar. No. Mr. Coons. No. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Ono.
Just want to clarify.
Mr. Booker.
No. Your second degree.
Mr. Padilla.
No.
Mr. Ossoff.
No.
Mr. Grassley. No. Mr. Graham. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sachs. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Tillis. Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin. Chair, the votes are 7 yeas, 15 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Any further amendments to 807? Senator Cotton?
But I would like to speak on the bill before the final vote.
Okay, let's see if there are any other amendments from any other members. If not, I'll recognize you. Senator Cruz, do you have another amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I do have another amendment. Hold on. I call up Amendment SIL 21757. And this is an amendment that would prevent packing the Supreme Court. Packing the Supreme Court has become more and more of a political issue, as Democrats in both chambers have been discussing doing precisely that. On the campaign trail last year, Joe Biden famously refused to answer whether he wanted to pack the court. And finally, he said he would, quote, go well beyond court packing if he became president, which I think is chilling. Packing the Supreme Court is a dangerous development. It's what we've seen happen in dictatorial countries in Central and South America when dictators want to increase their power. When Hugo Chavez wanted to consolidate his control on Venezuela, one of the first steps he did was pack Venezuela's Supreme Court with judges who would agree with him. Today, We have Democrats in both houses that are talking about expanding the Supreme Court from 9 justices to 13 justices, doing that in order to immediately put 4 left-wing justices on the court, and essentially to rig the system, to politicize the court, even more so than cameras in the courtroom. Notably, in the 1930s, when Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to pack the court because he was unhappy with some of the court's rulings, his own party, the Democratic Party, which had large majorities in both houses of Congress, opposed him. Opposed him because it would go too far, it would politicize the court, it would destroy the independence of the court, it would undermine the rule of law. And FDR did not succeed in packing the court. We've had 9 justices on the Supreme Court for 150 years. I would note that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg opposed packing the court. She said 9 seems like the right number. I would note current liberal Justice Stephen Breyer has likewise opposed packing the court and says 9 seems like the right number. I would note that Joe Biden, when he sat in Chairman Durbin's chair on this committee, described packing the Supreme Court as a, quote, boneheaded idea. Well, now that boneheaded idea is being advocated by multiple members of his own party, and President Biden is indicating he is open to that boneheaded idea. I think it would be profoundly damaging to the court, to the rule of law, and that it would threaten our fundamental rights. It would threaten free speech, religious liberty, the Second Amendment. The entirety of the Bill of Rights would be under assault if we were to pack the court. And so what this amendment does is it creates a point of order against legislation modifying the number of justices on the Supreme Court, against legislation increasing it or decreasing it. It keeps it at 9, where it's been for 150 years. And so I would urge adoption of my amendment.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I'd like to say a word. This amendment creates point of order, as senators noted. When it comes to modifying the number of justices in the U.S. Supreme Court, would require a supermajority vote, 2/3 of the Senate, to waive that point of order. On the question of rigging the court, let me set the record straight. There is only exactly one living senator who has changed the size of the Supreme Court. That's Senator McConnell, who shrank the court to 8 seats for nearly 1 year for purely political reasons by refusing to consider Merrick Garland's nomination. The so-called sacred number of 950-year-old tradition was obviously ignored by your leader to leave a vacancy on the court after the untimely death of Anton Scalia. Republicans engaged in court packing plain and simple when they refused to consider Garland's nomination in 2016 and then proceeded with the nomination of Justice Amy Coney Barrett in 2020 under extraordinary circumstances. If you'll remember, it was expedited. It was pretty clear what was going on there. Republicans' insistence now that the Supreme Court must remain at 9 seats, Democrats suggesting alternatives, it just is not supported by their conduct. The Constitution does not stipulate the number of Supreme Court justices. That's up to the Congress to decide. Congress has long had a history of addressing that issue. What President Biden has said and done is to establish a bipartisan commission to study Supreme Court reform. We should let this commission do its work and consider its recommendations. So I would oppose this amendment. Any others wishing to speak?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Leahy.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you, and I'm looking around this room. I believe I voted for more Republican nominated Supreme Court justices than anybody in this room, possible exception of Senator Grassley. And I think that's the way it should be. We vote these up or down. As you pointed out, we were not allowed by the Republicans to even bring up a vote up or down on a Democratic nominee. But I think of the 6 or so Republican nominees I voted for, and even members of my own party who may have voted otherwise, but I feel there should be votes. I think this this might be a nice political talking point on this point of order legislation, but it makes no sense to me. I would join with the chair.
Any other senators seeking recognition on the Cruz amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
I want to take a minute and respond to the narrative Chairman Durbin laid out. I recognize that it is today a Democratic talking point that President Trump nominating justices and the Senate confirming justices somehow constituted packing the court. And I recognize that Democrats are unhappy that Merrick Garland did not receive a hearing and was not confirmed. But it does violence to the English language to call filling vacancies on the Supreme Court packing the court. That's not what packing the court means. And it also doesn't mean declining to consider a vacancy. That's not what packing the court means either. The Constitution gives the Senate the power to advise and consent. Exercising that advise and consent authority is fully within the Senate's not only authority but responsibility. As the chairman knows well, for the entire history of our country, there's a long pattern of the Senate and the President operating as checks and balances. There have been multiple vacancies, Supreme Court vacancies, that have occurred during presidential election years. And the pattern has been consistent. When the President and the Senate are of the same party and there's a vacancy during a presidential election year, almost always that nominee is confirmed. And when the President and the Senate are of different parties and the vacancy occurs during a presidential year, almost always that vacancy isn't filled. That's not something that just happened magically the last 4 years. That's something that's happened for 200 years, for the history of our country. And I would point out it's not a new standard. It's not a novel standard. Multiple members of this committee are quite familiar with it. We talked a moment ago about when Joe Biden sat in the chair currently occupied by Senator Durbin. When Joe Biden was chairman of this committee and George W. Bush was president, Joe Biden articulated what has become known as the Biden rule, which is he said to George W. Bush, if there's a vacancy during this presidential election year, we, the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Democrats, will not fill it. It was Joe Biden who articulated that rule. And that check and balance has been consistent throughout our history, and I'll point out it is particularly appropriate when the American people have had a chance to speak. In 2012, the American people re-elected Barack Obama as president. I remember that year well because that was also the year I was elected to this body. When I arrived, Republicans were in the minority. Democrats had a majority. Democrats were feeling their oats, felt on top of the world because they had control. And I believe Democrats in 2012 overshot. They went too far. And the American people have a wonderful correcting mechanism when one party... And in 2014, the American people corrected it and shifted. Republicans won 9 seats in the Senate. We retired Harry Reid as majority leader, and we took control of the Senate. Now, Chairman Durbin, I can tell you a major issue on the campaign trail that Republican senators campaigned on is elect us to stop Barack Obama from nominating radical activists to the Supreme Court. And the voters made that decision to do so. The voters decided we want a check and balance. That's how the Constitution sets the system up. I'll make one final point. Packing the Supreme Court, what FDR tried to do, what the Democrats of the 1930s rejected as lawless and an abuse of power, what Ruth Bader Ginsburg has said would be a mistake, what Stephen Breyer has said would be a mistake, what Joe Biden said was boneheaded. Packing the Supreme Court means one very specific thing, adding new seats to the court, in this instance taking it from 9 to 13. And I will point out, Chairman Durbin, that Republicans in 2017 had the White House, the Senate, and the House. We could have tried to pack the Supreme Court. To the best of my knowledge, not a single Republican suggested that. And I, for one, would have opposed it. It would have been wrong. It would have been an abuse of power. to try to add justices to the Supreme Court. It's not an abuse of power to fill vacancies. That's the president's responsibility. It's not an abuse of power to exercise advice and consent. That's the Senate's responsibility. But what Democratic members of Congress are advocating, packing the Supreme Court, I believe, is an abuse of power. And it's a chance now for every member of this committee to get on record. Do you support packing the Supreme Court, adding 4 left-wing justices, and destroying the independence of the judiciary and undermining the rule of law? Or are you willing to abide by the rules that the court has followed for the last 150 years?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee.
I won't respond to some of the made-up arguments here, but I just put a couple of facts. It's an election year. You don't want radical judges. For nearly a year, Republicans blocked Merrick Garland, a person that a number of Republicans, even on this committee, had said was the sort of person they'd want to see on the Supreme Court. Certainly no radical. But they said, but it's an election year. I contrast that to another nominee who was brought here before the Senate in an election year. I believe it was a Democratic-controlled Senate. Republican president put the nominee for, and I think that nominee got over 90 votes, Anthony Kennedy. So let's just have our facts right.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Whitehouse.
We can argue about the nomenclature, but we were all witness to the unorthodox, extreme, and unprecedented measures taken in this committee to force the last 3 Supreme Court justices onto the court. We were all witness to the extent to which the Trump administration allowed a private interest to control their nominations turnstile, while that private interest took massive anonymous multi-million-dollar contributions. We were all witness to the anonymous money-funded TV ad campaigns, which took in checks as big as $17 million from unknown donors, so we don't know what business they might have had before the court, because they remain anonymous. And we all remain witness to the flotillas of anonymously funded amici who appear in concert before the court, and for whom the court has accepted that there's a special interest fast lane, most recently exhibited in the Cedar Point decision just this week. So you can call that what you want, but what I don't call that is normal. Thank you.
I would just add that within the last few weeks, Senator McConnell has been interviewed by Hugh Hewitt and suggested that in the second 2 years of the Biden presidency, there would be no vacancies filled on the Supreme Court. This does not reflect the delicate balance of power in our Constitution, strategy of manipulating the composition of the court. At this point, the question before us is the amendment offered by Senator Cruz. Want a roll call? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy? No. Mrs. Feinstein? Mr. Whitehouse? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Ona? No. Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Padilla?
No.
Mr. Ossoff?
No.
Mr. Grassley? Mr. Graham? Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Lee? Mr. Cruz? Mr. Sass? Mr. Hawley? Mr. Cotton? Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Tillis? Mrs. Blackburn? Chair Durbin?
Nope.
Chair, the votes are 11 yeas, 11 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I
Senator
hope
Grassley.
we're starting a vote on the floor. I hope we can move these 2 bills after a couple decades.
I'm ready if you are.
Yes, I am.
Are there any
Mr. Chair, I'd still like to speak briefly.
Senator Cotton.
After that, return to our usual partisan battle lines. I'll go back to the cameras in the courtroom bill, which obviously is not a partisan question. You see Senator Durbin, Senator Grassley working together, Senator Cornyn, Senator Klobuchar. And the justices on the Supreme Court appointed by both Republicans and Democrats agree as well that they shouldn't have those cameras. So I think this is an area where reasonable people of goodwill disagree. I think these measures are well-intended, but I do think they're ill-advised. I just want to say this, it's first time on the committee, I haven't had a chance to express my opinion. More sunlight, more transparency in government is usually a good thing, but I don't think it's particularly lacking in our court systems right now. All trials and arguments are open to the public. As Senator Klobuchar said, in practice that means you have to be physically present in many cases. But at our appellate courts and the Supreme Court, for instance, I think audio transcripts are available promptly. Many of the circuit courts are now streaming them. The Supreme Court, as we've heard, frequently posts the audio of its transcript or the audio of its arguments the same day if the case is significant and consequential. Obviously, they produce opinions that lay out their reasoning in great detail, something that we often don't do on our votes in the Senate. So there already is a great deal of transparency in our court system. What we balance that off against if we that we would lose if we introduce cameras, I do think that the video would often be taken out of context. Judges, especially appellate judges or Supreme Court justices, pose questions playing the devil's advocate. Elena Kagan may seem like a reactionary Republican in exchange with one advocate. Clarence Thomas may seem like a very liberal justice with another advocate. They may pose hypotheticals that seem extreme, that can be taken out of context. This is why I think most of the justices, in fact, all of the justices that have expressed the opinion, the 3 justices appointed by President Trump has not yet taken a position on it, have said they don't believe that we should introduce cameras into the courtrooms, that the audio recordings, the transcripts of arguments, the publicly stated reasons for their rulings is sufficient transparency. I agree with that position. I just think that there are more unintended consequences of introducing cameras into the courtroom than not. That's why I'll oppose this bill. I'll oppose the following bill as well, and I generally oppose in principle cameras in the courtroom. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me say my piece on that, and I'll let it stand there for now and in the future.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Hawley has asked for recognition, and if no other senator asks, we will call the roll on both bills immediately after.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I want to say that I am going to also oppose both of these bills, both these pieces of legislation, partly because I'm concerned about the separation of powers issue here with one branch of this government, Article 1, telling Article 3 how it can and cannot conduct its business. Having said that, I do want to say that I think there's another area that we can all agree on, which is that every court in the country ought to make all of its findings, its orders, and its opinions available to the public free of charge and accessible online through a single online platform. The practitioners in the room who have used PACER will know that PACER is really kind of a nightmare. And if you are a member of the general public, you can't get onto PACER, you have to pay fees, you have to have membership. That's just ridiculous. We should make all of those opinions, all of those findings, all of that available for free online, and I bet we can find bipartisan consensus on that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hawley, this issue was just raised by my staff with me this morning. I'd like to work with you on that. I think it's a legitimate concern. On the adoption of S. 807, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley.
No.
Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Tillis.
No by proxy. He told me he was going to vote aye, but if that's what he said, go ahead. No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair, the votes are 14 yeas, 9 nays.
S-807 is agreed to, and now the clerk will call the roll on S-818 by Senators Klobuchar, Grassley, Klobuchar, Cornyn, and others.
Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Ms. Corona. Aye. Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley. Aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Sass. No. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Tillis. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin. Chair on this vote, the yeas are 15, the nays are 7.
S-818 is agreed to, and the committee stands adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, just
Senator Cruz, I'm sorry.
very briefly, I would ask on the first vote on Margaret Strickland that I be recorded as voting in person rather than by proxy.
The record will so reflect.
Thank you.